All right, let's turn now into the 5th chapter of Romans this morning. And obviously, as the scripture was read, this is repetitious in what it's saying, in some ways, saying some different things as we go along. It's kind of hard to wade through. We're not going to wade through it word by word, but we're certainly going to get an overview of the thrust of this passage this morning. But a man by the name of Paul Pricer, he's a PhD at the Menninger Foundation, and writing in the Journal of Pastoral Care said this: "Sober observers of the contemporary scene, if they are old and wise enough, have a sense of history, and they cannot fail to register a sharply increased concern with the self and a claim to pleasures of and for the self during the late 1960s and the decade of the 1970s. Note my cautious phrasing of this sentence. I start with drawing a line between people with and without a sense of history. For one of the most striking observations I have made as a teacher is that the successive cohorts of students to which I have been exposed during these years manifest an increasingly ahistorical and even anti-historical outlook on all things, including their professions. Historical reflections about their fields of study produce weariness, boredom, if not belligerent disdain. To me, an old-timer with great interest in the historical unfolding of ideas in my basic sciences and a clinician as well, these new students' attitudes come through as cockiness, for they seem to convey two messages. One, don't bother me with the old rubbish, but get with it. Tell me quickly what is alive now. And secondly, history begins with me and my world. The past is just a lot of nonsense. And he goes on and talks about the self-centeredness that we see being engendered in our society and particularly in these young people in the last decade and this decade. And he says this: in response to this new narcissism, religious movements may find themselves stimulating bliss at the expense of awe, leaving no room for that profound dynamic ambiguity between awe and bliss, which is essential to man's encounter with the holy, that is, with God, because the nature of the holy is both grandeur and benevolence. And this morning we go back again into history. We go back all the way to the beginning of history. And in order for us to not just have some kind of something that turns us on for the moment, which may or may not be really significant, we need to go into that which will produce not just bliss, but awe. Awe in the knowledge of the holy. And in order to do that, we've got to understand our historical foundations. We've got to understand where we came from in order to know where we're going, what to do with the present. And so we're going back again to the very beginning of human history and God's creation of the first man, Adam. Now, the key to power over indwelling sin is union with Jesus Christ. That's the very essence, that's the very heart of knowing how to live above the power of indwelling sin. And in order for us to understand that, to get the perspective of that, we've got to understand our union originally with Adam. And so we continue to dwell on Adam, but of course the focus turns now in verses 15 to the end of the chapter primarily upon Christ and what we have in him and our union with him. And as we consider the first man, as we did last week, and his disobedience and the consequences, we focus again on the awesomeness of that. There was an immediate response, and there was an utter response on the part of God as he displayed his displeasure with man's rebellion. The immediate response was that only one transgression was committed. God didn't wait until man sinned further, until there was this great flood of sin and rebellion, which quickly came afterwards, and which has been with us historically to one degree or another all the way through human history. But the moment Adam sinned, he set in operation the law of sin and death, displaying his displeasure with sin. And furthermore, God did not take halfway measures, but came with the full weight of his condemnation. Now, you and I have a scale of penalties. According to the scale of penalties, we have proportionately a scale of aggravation with that. If someone steals something from out of a house, he gets so much time in jail. If that person forces his way in through a window or a door, he spends more time in prison. If he steals a certain amount of money, it goes over a certain number of dollars in value, then he gets more time in prison. If he carries a lethal weapon, it will be even more time in prison. And no law court on the face of the earth would sentence a man to death for stealing a piece of fruit out of an orchard. But God not only moved immediately, but he moved completely and put the death sentence upon Adam and upon his posterity to the remotest generation for the one sin, for the one disobedience, and plunged man into sin and death. What do we conclude? Obviously, the tremendous seriousness of sin, that God displayed his attitude, his utter, his complete, his instantaneous hatred of sin. And so it's with this backdrop that we focus this morning upon that dam that God threw across this flood of sin and rebellion, the dam of his love and his grace and his mercy in Jesus Christ, and has made it possible for us not only to regain what man had originally in Adam, but much more than Adam ever enjoyed. And we notice in verse 14, at the end of verse 14, as we pick up from last week in our chapter, that Adam is a type of him who was to come. Now, there is a comparison here between Jesus Christ and the first Adam, the first man, the first Adam and the last Adam, as 1 Corinthians 15 refers to them as. And the comparison is this. There are two men, each who performed a single act, one of them a disobedience and one of them obedience. But each performed a single act and resulted in a single result being experienced by every individual in their respective races. Those in Adam's race all experienced the same result. And those by God's grace placed into Jesus Christ all experienced the same result. And the rest of it is a contrast. And we see it unfolding here. For example, in verse 15, but the free gift is not like the transgression. So the comparison is laid first of all. Again, there are two men, each who performed a single act that brought forth a single result, and the single result is experienced by every individual in their respective races. And the rest of it is a contrast. And again, this is hard to wade through. This is hard to get the meaning. And we're going to try to make it as simple as possible. I think one thing that helps us is to understand, maybe to illustrate this by two trees. Here's a tree over here that is rotten at the roots. And that tree produces rotten fruit. Inevitably, inexorably, will rotten fruit be produced from this rotten tree. Now, some of that fruit looks very good, maybe on the outside, but you bite into it and there's going to be rottenness in that fruit. That's us in Adam. We are under the law of sin and death by nature and brought into this as we bear rotten fruit inevitably because we are in Adam. Over here is another tree, and it's the good tree, representing Jesus Christ. And God, by His grace, as we put our faith in Him and this one act of obedience at the cross that reverses all of this. I think I'm going to have to stop at this moment. I think I'm losing my audience because of the ventilation in here. Could we maybe get some ventilation and keep people from somehow going to sleep? Would someone help us? I'm interested in you getting this message. Would someone give us some ventilation, please? All right. Here's the good tree over here in Jesus Christ. And we're grafted into that by grace through faith. And as we're grafted into that, that's the good tree, and that produces the good fruit, the good life. It produces that which God accepts and which brings honor and glory to Him. There's some limitations to that illustration, obviously, and that is that we do not lose our sin nature. We do not become sinless the moment we are placed in union with Christ. But we then have the capacity to bear the good fruit, life. Instead of sin, death, and condemnation, there is justification and life and righteousness in Jesus Christ. Now let's quickly go through some of these verses. First of all, in verse 15. But the free gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of the one the many died, much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound to the many. The contrast there is one transgression, and that brings death. And the other is of course, the act of obedience by Jesus Christ, and that bringing grace and grace abounding. Now here's another one of these much mores that we have in our passage. And again, the concept here, and you would just draw a mental diagram. Right here is Adam at this level. And he had fellowship with God. He was in a sinless state. And he had a perfect environment and so on. But he had fellowship with God. And here he was at this level. And then came his disobedience and what we call the fall. And down here is man in the fall, the way every one of us are born. And in Jesus Christ, as we are placed into Jesus Christ, we're brought not to the level of where Adam was. And this is certainly including our future destiny and all that there is in eternity future. But we have a level of experience and privilege and blessing that goes beyond what Adam lost for us, what Adam originally had, and reverses not only what was lost for us in the fall, but the much more. We are in Jesus Christ. And this will be given to us more and more as we go along. Now in verse 16, we see the effect of Adam's sin being contrasted with the effect of Christ's obedience. And we read this, "And the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from the one transgression, resulting in condemnation. But on the other hand, the free gift arose from many transgressions, resulting in justification." All right, there's the one transgression here by Adam, and this resulted in judgment, condemnation. And then there is the free gift by Jesus Christ, and in the light of this, there are many transgressions resulting in justification. Now, the one transgression very much merited the sentence of death and condemnation. But what this is saying is that, on the other hand, the free gift arose from many transgressions resulting in justification. If one transgression resulted in condemnation, then you would think that many transgressions would result in something even worse. But we see here that the many transgressions, the free gift arises from many transgressions resulting in justification. And here we see the battle in the dual nature of God. On one side, His love and His mercy cry out for forgiveness, and on the other side, His justice cries out for condemnation. And so the one act of Jesus Christ, the one final, complete, and totally satisfying act of Jesus Christ at the cross makes it possible for God to be totally satisfied with the many transgressions which we're involved with, to reverse that and bring about, instead of what we deserve, justification of life, resulting in justification, as we see it here in verse 16. The cross of Jesus Christ is what makes this all possible, and we stand in wonder and awe as we think of what God has provided to reverse all of this and more that has resulted from Adam's one transgression. Now we see in verse 17 the two reigns are contrasted. For if by the transgression of the one, that is Adam, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. From Adam's one sin, death reigns. From Christ's one act of obedience, we reign in life through him. And so the two reigns are being discussed here and contrasted. And this death here, of course, is not just the physical death, not the funeral at the end of life, but is spiritual death as well. There are three kinds of death in the Scripture. There is the spiritual death, the separation from God. The only remedy, of course, is the new birth. There is the physical death, and the only remedy for that is the resurrection of the dead. And then there is eternal death, of which there is no remedy. But this is talking about something more than physical death reigning here. It's talking about spiritual death reigning. And that's the emptiness and the loneliness and the misery and the desperation and the discouragement and the restlessness that all of us experience. This is the thing that reigns because of the act of the one man and that we find ourselves under until we reign in life in Jesus Christ. And the very essence of this spiritual death is man taking the throne of his own life instead of God having his rightful place. It's man having usurped the rightful place of God and taking that place of centrality. A couple of weeks or so ago in the Dear Ann Landers column appeared this letter to Ann Landers that gives us an example, gives us a primary example of what spiritual death is. Dear Ann Landers, your generation of twisted logic and phony values takes the prize for packing more mistakes into one life cycle than any generation in history. Small wonder that we, your children, have turned our backs on your conventional lifestyle. You were masters of building a facade to help to hide duplicity and hypocrisy. I have discovered freedom, and it's terrific. I am free to smoke pot and do stronger drugs if I choose. I can weigh the consequences, and if I want to take a chance, it's my business. The buzzword is freedom, and I think it's the niftiest word in the English language. My hero is Fritz Perls, who said, quote, "I do my thing, and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in the world to live up to mine. You are you, and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful." End quote. No more being a slave to what other people think. From now on, I put me first on the list of what's important and recommend it for everyone who is short on self-esteem and gets kicked in the teeth a lot. Sign me, numero uno. Now, if that is not an example of man enthroned on the life and God dethroned. Now, what he's saying, of course, about the parents, and of course, this downward spiral, it takes about 3 or 4 generations, but here's the original family, here's the original generation, responding to God, obedient to him, but the second generation comes along, the generation of Ann Landers, and takes the outward mores, the outward do's and don'ts of the parents, but leaves out the essence, and that is God being enthroned, and all of this coming from a relationship where God is enthroned. And that's spiritual death as well, even though there is a sense of responsibility that is taken by that second generation, and they live up to expectations, and they have standards, and they try to respect the rights and the feelings of other people and so on, and are good citizens. They have nothing to pass on to that third generation, except we feel this is right and you should do this, but they have no basis for it. And the third generation comes along and says, this is phony. This is empty. This is hollow. Or possibly it takes to the fourth generation. And they want to throw off all of these things because they have no basis for them. They have no reason. They haven't gotten the real reason because it's missed a generation in between. And that is because of God and His standards. And so there is this throwing off. But in the second, the third, and the fourth generations, there still is this spiritual death where man is enthroned. And death reigns. And only can life be there when we allow Christ to take that proper place of enthronement in our lives. And so we see that, according to verse 17, that the gift, those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. We can actually reign in life. With all of the pressures, with all of the hard realities of life, we can be on the throne. We can be reigning, not under the pile, not under the circumstances, but we can be reigning in life through the one, Jesus Christ. And even as we looked at the early part of Romans there, talking about exulting in tribulation, and we can actually exult in tribulation when we have that proper relationship, when we have received the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness in Jesus Christ. And we can face whatever may come. I was having breakfast with several of our men who meet every Wednesday morning over at one of the restaurants over at the Villa Capri restaurant this Wednesday, and they were asking me about Romans 6 truth, which we're really bridging right now here in Romans 5. And they were asking me about the fact that how can we really operate on this in a way that's going to be consistent. And one of them cited some people that taught these truths, these Romans 6 truths about power over indwelling sin and our relationship with Christ and being in union with Him. And he said, how come some people can even teach this and end up in such a mess? And I emphasize that the danger here so often is to get a hold of this truth and treat it simply as a formula, and even communicate it very clearly as a formula, instead of letting this truth come and cause us to focus upon Christ Himself, cause us to be able to relate to Him in a way that we come into a deep and personal and intimate relationship with Him, and using the truth here, as we are bridging it, as we are broaching it, getting into here the last part of Romans 5 and into Romans 6, the truth of union with Jesus Christ, seeing it in a way that causes us to have a personal, intimate relationship with a person. I was talking with another person recently as we had lunch together. And he said, well, what I like to have when I come to hear a message and so on, what I like to have is something that I can do, some practical application, some kind of a method, some kind of 5 steps, I think is what he meant, in being able to relate more effectively to somebody else at the office or wherever I am. And that's a tremendous thing. That's a wonderful thing. And we need to have that. But we need to realize, first of all, that we need to be before we do. We need to realize this relationship of union with Jesus Christ and reign with Him out of this relationship, and then it extends into the horizontal. Here is the vertical, and to understand this vertical first and to operate on it, and it's basically a personal relationship with Him, and then let it flow into the horizontal. You find that Paul writes his letters this way. He writes Ephesians, the first 3 chapters. He shows us our position in Jesus Christ. He shows us what it means to be in union with Christ. And then he spends the last 3 chapters in how that works out in our lives. Romans actually spends the first 11 chapters in showing us this union with Christ, and then letting out of this union, letting His life flow through us by grace through faith. Then it gets into the practical horizontal level into our lives as it reaches us in every sphere of our life wherever we turn. But we could illustrate it further by this. I gave you the trees, the 2 trees. Well, let's take the hand of the criminal. Here's the criminal over here, and there's surgery done, and that hand is amputated. And that hand is taken, of course, this is surgically impossible, at least at this time, but it's a good illustration. And the hand is taken and it's grafted into the wrist of the prince, Jesus Christ. And the past history and the past experience of the prince now becomes the past history and the past experience of the hand. Jesus Christ died. Jesus Christ was buried. He was raised. He's ascended. He's sitting at the throne of the universe right now. And all of that past history of his becomes ours because we're vitally joined with Jesus Christ. And unless we somehow not only intellectually conceptualize this, but unless we get a hold of this and God enlightens us and this becomes a part and parcel of our daily experience, then all of the expression on the horizontal level is going to be meaningless. It's going to be legalism, unless our life is one that flows out of a recognition and a response to the living head, his life flowing in and through us, and it's his enablement. And so what Paul is saying here is that we can reign in life because we have been placed from out of Adam, taken from out of Adam and placed into Jesus Christ. And you notice the word abundance here at the end of verse 17. It's an abundant grace that we have, overflowing. Now quickly the two one acts in verses 18 and 19. So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness. The one transgression was Adam's rebellion. He chose to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act, that is at the cross. One act of righteousness, there resulted justification of life. And this means more than just the legal standing here, but justification of life means a life can flow only from the one who is life. Nothing short of complete union with the risen Christ is being spoken about here. And then verse 19, for as through one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, even so through the obedience of the one the many were made righteous. They were made righteous, and this is talking about a practical living righteousness as well. And we have this all because we have been taken from out of Adam. As we, by faith, have received Christ, realized our condition, we've been taken from out of Adam. We reign in life, verse 17. We have justification of life, verse 18. And we are made righteous, verse 19. We have all of this because we have been placed vitally in Jesus Christ. We have an inseparable and constant union with him, inseparable and constant union with all of his fullness. The law was brought in, verses 20 and 21, very quickly. The law came in that the transgression might increase. The law wasn't there to save us, but on the contrary, not solving the sin problem, it just made sin more realizable. And it came in that the transgression might increase. Instead of actually remedying the problem, it causes us to see the sin problem aggravated. That's what the law does. That's what the standard of the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount, if you take it into the New Testament, does. It simply aggravates the sin problem. But where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. There's this overflowing grace, all the more. Very similar, very identical type of a phrase than the much more that we saw in verse 15. We saw it again in verse 17. We see this in verse 20 now, the much more. And then the summary statement, verse 21. That as sin reigned in death, even so grace might reign through righteousness to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. This final statement here, as we have it. Two men. One man at the head of his race, the other man at the head of his new humanity. One act of disobedience bringing sin, death, and condemnation. The other man, one act of obedience bringing justification, life, and righteousness, and forming this new humanity. And I wonder this morning, do we have new life in Jesus Christ, first of all? Have we received, according to verse 17, those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through one, Jesus Christ? Have we really received him? And if we have, are we actually having this life dominate us? Having this life flow in and through us so that what is coming out of our lives is not mere humanism and legalism, but is the life of Jesus Christ being reproduced through us. In closing, I want to give an incident that happened several years ago. A barge sunk in the Hudson River, the New York Harbor, and it was firmly embedded at the bottom of the river. The owners had all kinds of consternation. How were they going to salvage this very expensive piece of property that had sunk there at the bottom of the Hudson River? And so, not being able to lift it with normal means, they put their heads together and they decided, well, we'll get these huge floating cranes. And the huge floating cranes were brought in and they tried to hoist the barge from the bottom of the river and it wouldn't budge. It was just stuck there in the mud, in the mire, unable through any of these man-made devices to hoist this very valuable piece of property. Finally, one of the tugboat captains got a bright idea. And they sent down deep-sea divers and they attached these huge steel cables to the barge. And then at low tide, they attached them to the other vessels there in the river, in the harbor. And as the tide began to flow in, the irresistible power of the Atlantic Ocean caused these vessels to be buoyed up and the barge finally to be loosened, and the barge slowly floated to the surface and it was retrieved. Now you and I, by nature, as we're born into this world, are like that sunken barge. We're embedded, we're stuck in the mire of being numero uno, of being on the throne of our lives, of being self-centered rather than God-centered, and under the sentence of sin, death, and condemnation. And no man-made devices, no man-made activities can possibly get us loose as we're embedded in this despondency and this emptiness and this loneliness and this restlessness, this spiritual death. But the irresistible force of Jesus Christ as we come into living, vital union with him, taking his word, taking that objective external frame of reference, his word, and trusting him through it and coming into vital contact with him and allowing this one with whom we have been placed, our living head, to allow his irresistible life to flow through us and to be lifted out of the mire of a self-centered, lost, helpless, hopeless life. I wonder this morning, those of you who have never made this step of faith, you've never made it, are you going to stay down, embedded there at the bottom? Won't you let Christ lift you? And those of us who know him, how shameful our lives are as we see so much of ourselves flowing through it instead of Jesus Christ. So much of self-centeredness, so much of me, myself, and I, and not responding and sensitively letting Jesus Christ live his life through us.